Well, hey guys, thanks for tuning in to Athens Church today. Before we dive into today's episode, I want to encourage you to consider something in this crazy, tumultuous fall that we're in. I think this is one of the most important times ever for each of us to have a plan for our spiritual growth. For you, for your family, for your children, for everyone involved. This is an important time. So regardless of how you're engaging with Athens Church, I think it's important that we not just drift through this season, but rather we develop an intentional plan for how we're going to grow spiritually. And as you know, here at Athens Church, we've got a number of options. Obviously, small groups are a big part of our plan. Serving is often a part of our spiritual plan. But in terms of engaging with us on Sunday, we're really maximizing this idea of options. You can join us online with our kids, teenager, and adult content. You can join us outdoors on our green space as we have a video overflow of our service every Sunday. Or you can join us indoors where we have all of our family ministry environments wide open, and we have two options for you in terms of our adult worship experience in the auditorium and in the theater. So we're trying to provide as many options as possible. But here's the big idea. Regardless of how you engage, the important thing is that you have a plan for your spiritual growth. So I hope you'll develop that plan. I hope you'll let us know how we can help you along the way. And let's dive into today's episode.
So great to be with you. I love this place. And you have to see it from my perspective for just a little bit. I remember well over 15 years ago, your pastor, Sean C. and I drove up one Friday in Athens because God was stirring in his heart and Bonnie's heart to maybe plant a church in Athens. And then I was at your very first service at Cedar Shoals High School, then the Classic Center days, and then this amazing space, your new green space. And when Wendy and I drove up today, we just paused and thought, this is absolutely amazing. So if this is your first time here, maybe you're in the auditorium, or those of you in the theater, or maybe you're watching online, you're surrounded by some of the most generous people around. And as someone who loves this city, as an alumnus of the University of Georgia, go Dogs. How about them Dogs, by the way? There you go. Thank you for letting Athens know that you love them. By the way, where's Jamie from Sparrow's Nest? Where are you? Thank you. I mean, seeing that video and remembering Sean and I driving around this city, only God. Well, I'm so thrilled that you're here today, and I'm very excited about what we're going to talk about. And to kind of help prepare what we're going to talk about, I want to show you three of the more popular social media memes that have tried to help describe what we are experiencing in 2020. And I think this will kind of help, believe it or not, prepare us for what I have for you today. The first one is very simply this: if 2020 was a scented candle, this is kind of how 2020, the aroma of 2020, I think that does a good job maybe describing what we're experiencing. The other is if 2020 was a coffee mug, this is what drinking a coffee mug out of 2020 would be like, kind of a hard experience there. And then my personal favorite throwback to the 80s and Lionel Richie, hello, is it me that you're looking for? And so that's really cool. I think we've gotten a little bit better on the toilet paper supply chain. But when it comes to 2020 and these social media themes, it's kind of the old adage, you got to laugh to keep from crying, because the reality is 2020 has thrown something our way that's really unprecedented, and you don't need me to tell you that. But as we have experienced this year, one of the many reasons why Athens Church is doing this series is that it brings up some emotions, some natural emotions, some normal emotions, and yet if we're not careful, these natural, normal emotions can erode the plans that God has for us, that they can erode the journey that God has for us. In fact, specifically today, I want to talk about the emotion of weariness. And I believe all of us can connect to this emotion. In fact, here's how. If you've ever said, how much longer is this going to be? That's an indication of weariness. If you've ever said, when are we going to get back to normal? That's a sign of weariness. And let me tell you, those of you here, the theater, online, that's actually completely normal. That's a normal reaction, and yet there is an elusive, if not sinister, danger to the emotion of weariness. And I want to explain that to you today. Now, the definition, as you know, of weariness is simply this: the reluctance to see or experience any more of something. Or maybe within our context today, the reluctance to see or experience any more of 2020. That's when we're saying, hey, when can 2021 get here? How much longer is this going to be? But the challenge with weariness is this. You see, when it comes to anger, we can see anger. I mean, you can see anger on my face, or I can see anger on your face. So anger is easy to detect. But when it comes to weariness, causes our shoulders to drop, our chins to lower, and the vision that we have for our lives begins to get blurry. And more importantly, the vision that God has for our lives begins to diminish and get blurry. And here's the danger of weariness. And here's one of the many reasons why we're so glad that you're here today or watching online, because here's the danger. When it comes to weariness wears down. It chisels down. It sands down the vision that God has for you. It sands down and visions the vision that you might have for your hopes or your relationships or your future hopes and dreams. And more importantly, weariness can chisel away at the vision that God has for our lives. And as a result of that, weariness can cause us to listen to our excuses. Well, you know what? It's such a bad year. I'll have another bottle of this and I'll have another bowl of that. And before we know it, we are now in unhealthy patterns because the sinister, elusive danger of the emotion of weariness, which is completely understandable, is wearing down the hopes and the dreams and the vision that God has for your life. That's why in this amazing series in week 2, Sean talked about, hey, here's where we're going in this series. And for you to understand where we're going and for you to completely understand the battle for your heart and for your mind and your soul, here's what you have to understand. Week 2, Sean said this: there is an ongoing battle for the direction of your life. It's an ongoing spiritual battle. And that's what weariness is. Weariness is a battle for your heart and for your soul and for the direction of your life. He also said this: the key to winning that battle, and what we're going to talk about today, the key to winning the battle of weariness is to let the Spirit of God guide your life. The scriptures teach that Christ in you is the hope of glory and that there is an answer to the challenge of weariness. And then Sean also said this, that the evidence of whether you and I are winning this battle is the fruit of the Spirit. And that's what this series has been about, the fruit of the Spirit, that when you and I walk moment by moment, day by day, and we allow God to do what only God can do, then we look back in our lives and go, wow, look at what God did. Not what I did. Look at what God did in my life. And so today, what we want to do is discuss how do we walk by the Spirit and contrast weariness. That's why one of the foundational verses in this series is Galatians chapter 5. Galatians chapter 5:16 says, so I say, walk by the Spirit and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. So when weariness is trying to chisel away at your hopes and your dreams and the vision that God has for you, what we want to do is to teach you today how to walk by the Spirit so that there is a contrasting fruit of the Spirit that can be given and grown and produced through the Spirit, through you. And that's why I want to talk about today the fruit of the Spirit of faithfulness. Faithfulness in a time of weariness. Faithfulness in a time of weariness. And you might say, well, Jeff, shouldn't it be rest in a time of weariness? But rest actually is a byproduct of faithfulness. That when I am at rest, I am trusting God. When I am at peace, I am trusting God. That God is still at work in my life. That's why I want to do a couple of things for you today. First of all, I want to give you one of my life verses. This verse rocked my world many, many years ago. And it actually is one of the foundational verses and one of the foundational statements of my life. It's a question actually that Jesus asked in Luke 18, and it really ties into this idea of faithfulness. Jesus asked this question: when the Son of Man comes, when Jesus returns, will he find faith on the earth? When I come back, will I find faith on the earth? And so when I saw this verse many, many years ago, I began to think, if Jesus were to come back today, would he find me faithful as a husband? Would he find me faithful as a father? Would he find me faithful as a financial steward? Would he find me faithful as a leader? And so what I decided to do is I created these declarative statements in my life. And it simply starts with these 4 words: to be found faithful. And these words, I would have a declarative statement. To be found faithful as a husband, and I would have a declarative statement about what that looks like for me. To be found faithful as a father, I would have a declarative statement. This is what it looks like for me to be found faithful. So that if Jesus were to come back, and he were to say, Jeff, am I finding faith in your life? But ultimately, he'd have to go to Wendy. And ultimately, he'd have to go to Jesse and Cole. And ultimately, he'd have to go to our online banking account. And ultimately, he'd have to go to the people I work with and go, hey, is Jeff being found faithful? In Athens Church, there is a huge opportunity for you this week if you will think of faithfulness in those terms, because someday that's going to happen. Another thing that Sean talked about in week 2 is if we're going to understand how the fruit of the Spirit works, we're going to have an eternal perspective. And if you don't have an eternal perspective, weariness is going to undermine your soul. That's why a friend of mine said recently, I feel like 2020 is making my soul tired and weary. Of course. But there is a fruit of the Spirit so that you can be found faithful when Jesus returns. That's why I want to do a couple things today. First, I want to remind you of God's vision for your life. God has a vision for your life. College students, God has a vision for your life. Adults, God has a vision for your life. And what weariness wants to do is chisel away at that vision. But when you and I can get locked in, what happens is, and this is my hope for you, this is what I've been praying for you this week, that when you leave Athens Church today, that your shoulders are kicked back a little more stronger, and that your chin is higher, and your vision toward where God is taking you is clear, even in the midst of uncertainty. So I want to talk about God's vision for your life. And when we understand God's vision for our life, it leads us to our bottom line today, which is simply this. Don't let what we don't know rob us of what we can do. Don't let what we don't know. There's a lot that we don't know, right? There's a lot that a lot of people don't know. But at the end of the day, don't let that uncertainty rob you of what you can do. In Athens Church, I've got one thing for you to do this week. One thing for you to do. But for you and I to do this, we're going to have to abide and walk by the Spirit so that the Spirit will allow this one thing to happen. And I'm telling you, Athens Church, I believe this with all of my heart, that this week is an extraordinary opportunity that will stand the test of time if you lean in. And if you open up your hearts and your souls and say, Spirit of the living God, produce this fruit of faithfulness in my life this week. Now, to do that, here's where we're going to go for our remaining few minutes together. Back in March, when the pandemic hit, I was actually just reading through the book of John in my personal devotional time. And in John chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3, these verses that I've read, I'm a preacher's kid. I've been to church all my life. I went to church 9 months before I was born. I've done this all my life, okay? But these verses just rocked me in a really, really great way. In fact, I've really stayed in these 3 verses since then. And these 3 verses are going to lead us to one thing that I think the Spirit of God can produce in our hearts, and to do one action item this week so that you and I, through God's help, can choose faithfulness in a time of weariness. Now, to understand John chapter 12, you have to understand John chapter 11, because John chapter 11 was this foundational story in the life of Jesus. You know the story, perhaps. Jesus gets word that one of his friends, Lazarus, is sick. He gets word from Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, who are also friends of Jesus. And so they send word to Jesus because they know beyond the shadow of a doubt that when Jesus hears that Lazarus is sick, he's going to stop everything he's doing and come running. And that's exactly what doesn't happen. And Lazarus gets more and more sick, and he eventually passes away. Then Mary and Martha look up, and well, guess who has arrived late to the event? Jesus. And they have some interactions with Jesus, a little passive-aggressive action going on, which I think we can all understand. Because Jesus, you showed up late. Can you relate to that? Has Jesus ever shown up late for you? Maybe for some of you, this is your first time back in church for a long time because several years ago, you prayed and Jesus didn't show up according to your timeline, which I totally understand. And you said, well, this just doesn't work for me. And you walked away. Let me tell you, the scriptures are full of stories like this but they're also full of stories of God's faithfulness. So Jesus walks up onto the scene, has an interaction with Mary and Martha, walks up to the tomb, asks people to roll the stone away. He prays this amazing prayer and says, Lazarus, come forth, and this dead man comes out of the tomb. Everybody loses their minds in a really great way, and it's a foundational story. That's John chapter 11. Then John chapter 12 is kind of the epilogue. It's kind of the after party. And this is John chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3. These verses are going to give you a symbolic picture of God's vision for your life. And it's going to give you this one action item we have for you today to allow you to partner with the Spirit of God so the Spirit of God can produce faithfulness for you to do one thing this week. So this is John chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. In other words, yes, that Lazarus. Here, a dinner was given in honor of Jesus. And this is a really important point. This wasn't just a dinner. This wasn't just friends hanging out. No, this was maybe a banquet, if you will, where people got up and maybe they gave speeches. You've been to perhaps a retirement party. You've been to maybe an athletic banquet where people gave, speeches and recognized one person. Well, that's what they're doing here. This is a dinner given in honor of Jesus. And don't miss the power of this party. Don't miss the wonder of this party. So as people are, it's at a party and they're eating and drinking and all this stuff's going on and everybody's, having a good time. At some point, I think the people at the party looked and thought, I went to that guy's funeral and now he's here. I wept at the memorial service of him. And yet now he's laughing with Jesus. Imagine the wonder. Imagine the joy. Imagine the awe of the moment. That's the party that's happening here in Athens Church. Little clue, this event, it's symbolic for where you're headed. So here, a dinner party was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served. So John begins to tell us what's happening at the party. Martha served. And Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at the table. By the way, we should come back some other time to talk about what Martha is doing and what Lazarus is doing. But what I want to do in our remaining time is to focus on what Mary is doing. Because what Mary is doing is your action item this week, Athens Church, to allow the Spirit of God to rise faithfulness up in you and to do one thing. This is what Mary did. Mary, therefore, took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. Now, I'm making this up, right? But I'm imagining in the loud conversations and all that's going on. I think as Mary went and did this, I think at some point, just one man's opinion, I think everything got quiet. And they turned to Mary. And I think everyone had this powerful, worshipful moment as she takes this expensive perfume, pours it on the feet of Jesus and wipes his feet with her hair. And then verse 3 ends with this: the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Athens Church, don't miss this. When Jesus walked to the tomb of Lazarus, he was told, don't open the tomb because the odor is bad. Jesus walks onto the scene and everything changes. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. When Jesus shows up, life smells better. When Jesus shows up, he heals us. When Jesus shows up, we have a vision. When Jesus shows up, there's a faith rising, even when we have a great case for weariness. But what I want you to see today is this: that as we are processing John chapter 12, and it's great, there was another time that I wonder if when Mary was pouring this expensive perfume over the feet of Jesus and she was wiping his feet with her hair, I wonder if she remembers the last time she was at his feet. Because the last time she was at his feet, she had a different perspective. The last time she was at his feet, she was very upset. The last time she was at his feet, she was pretty angry. In fact, this is John chapter 11. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was. So Jesus is coming, he's late to the event. Lazarus has died. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet. But this time, there's no expensive perfume. She confronts him in a passive-aggressive way. Lord, if you had been here, meaning, where are you and where were you? Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now, not trying to be critical to Mary, but what I want to show you is this. There's John chapter 11, verse 32, where she's confronting Jesus and falls at his feet. And then John chapter 12, verse 3, that says this: Mary, therefore, took a pound of expensive ointment from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped the feet with her hair. Here's why I say this, Athens Church. It's a beautiful moment when Mary is pouring this wonderful perfume out on Jesus when everything has been answered. It's a completely different moment when you still choose to pour out your very best when Jesus hasn't answered your prayer yet. It's a completely different step of faith when you go, you know what? I don't see how everything is playing out. You know what? I don't know how long this is going to last. I don't know where this is going to go, but you know what, Jesus? Even though I can't see it, I'm still going to choose to pour out my best. When you do that, your faith rises. When you do that, Jesus gets greater glory. And when you do that, here's what's going to happen eventually for you. And don't miss this, Athens Church. This whole dinner party, you know why this is symbolic for you? And Sean talked about this, as I mentioned earlier, about the eternal perspective. What the scriptures teach is that there's a feast coming your way in eternity. There's a party that you've been invited to. There's a party in the family of God that you have been invited to. And when you place your faith in Jesus, you get a down payment to the party forever and forever and forever. And here's what I believe about the party in eternity with Jesus. When you're at the dinner party with Jesus, I think at some point, Jesus is going to have a conversation with you. And the conversation is going to sound something like this. Hey, remember the year 2020? And we're going to go, remember, we can never forget that. And I think Jesus is going to say, I want to tell you, I saw when you were confused, when you didn't know how much longer this was going to last, when you lost the job, the situation with school, all of that, you continued to pour out your best. I saw that. Well done. Well done. And the one thing I want to point you to today, Athens Church, is as you keep your eyes locked on that eternal vision, that someday you're going to have a conversation with Jesus in eternity, and what you can do this week and in this season shows up there. Are you kidding me? This week is an extraordinary opportunity. And yes, I'm not trying to say the challenges in our lives are petty. I'm not trying to downplay the challenges in our lives. By the way, I have my own challenges in my life, by the way. But what I'm trying to tell you is this. The challenges in our lives are chapters. The faithfulness of Jesus is the story. The challenges of our lives, they are real. But at some point, the chapter comes to an end. But the faithfulness of Jesus will ride forever. Do you want to get on that ride? Do you want to choose weariness or do you want to choose faithfulness? Not downplaying the situation. But I'm telling you, the Spirit of the living God is near. The Spirit of the living God lives in you. And the Spirit of the living God can allow faithfulness to rise. When you understand that, yes, 2020 is hard. 2020 is a challenge, but 2020 is a chapter. And Jesus is the story. So knowing that, here's my challenge to you today, Athens Church. Those of you over in the theater, you guys with me, those of you watching online, those of you here, here's some questions I want you to wrestle with this week. And here's why. These questions, admittedly, and Josh mentioned this a little earlier, these questions, admittedly, are a little challenging, right? And I don't give you these challenging questions to confront you. I give you these challenging questions to love you and to encourage you to let faith rise. But these questions all go back to the vision of an eternal vision of where you're headed, and for you this week to pour out your best. Maybe just in one area. But I I want you to do what Mary did. And yet what you're doing is you're not pouring out your best in John chapter 12. You're pouring out your best in John chapter 11 when things are not yet clear. So maybe you don't want to process all these questions, but I would highly encourage you to at least process one. And not just you, but with your small group, your roommate, the people in your life. So let's close with these few questions. Number one, where in your life do you need to be found faithful? Where in your life have you slipped? Is it financially? Is it relationally? Is it your screen time? Where in your life, is it your physical health? Is it your emotional health? Is it your spiritual health? Where in your life do you need to be found faithful? And come on, you know this to be true. We can trick ourselves if left to our own devices. This is why you need to ask this week to your small group or the people in your life. Hey, as you look at my life, where do I need to be found faithful? Or maybe you need to ask it, give me one area of my life where I need to be found faithful. That might be more safer, okay? Where do you need to be found faithful? Question number two, where in your life have you stopped pouring out your best for Jesus? Where in your life have you stopped pouring out your best for Jesus? And you may say, Jeff, I'm just so weary. I am just so tired. I totally understand that. That's why this fruit of the Spirit, faithfulness, we've had to lean into the Spirit of God and say, God, I'm weary. I'm tired, and left to my own devices, I will drift toward weariness. But can you let faithfulness, the fruit of faithfulness, one of the fruits of the Spirit, rise in my life so that, Lord, I can pour out my best this week. In Athens Church, I've already said this, but I got to say it again. If there is one thing that you do this week through the Spirit of God and through the faithfulness, the fruit of faithfulness, and pour out just one thing, I'm telling you, here's what I believe, just one man's opinion, but I'm pretty smart because I graduated from the University of Georgia. Just one man's opinion. I think it's going to show up in eternity. This week. There is no such thing as an ordinary week when your vision is locked on eternity with Jesus. It doesn't exist. There is no such thing as an ordinary week. It's an extraordinary opportunity, but the fruit of faithfulness is going to have to rise. The fruit of faithfulness is going to have to grow so that you can pour out your best even in a time of weariness. Third question, where in your life have you become weary and started letting excuses drive you? Where in your life have you become weary and started letting excuses drive you? And there's all kinds of things that we can excuse ourselves of. And hey, I'm not saying that we shouldn't give ourselves a break, but what happens is when we give ourselves a break and we look up 6 months later and yet these breaks have become habits and we now find ourselves in ruts, you got to be really, really careful. And this is why you need someone on the other side of you to say, hey, can I tell you that I think you're buying into your own excuses? And while I understand the weariness and why you would want to go there, ultimately, it's not going to serve you well. That's why Sean in week 2 said, hey, there's a battle going on. There's a battle going on. And the battle is going to try to convince you to listen to your excuses versus listening and keeping your eye on the vision of God's future for you. Then here's a really important question that you need to be honest with yourself. I need to be honest with myself. What do you do when you are weary? What do you do when you are weary? Men, online is an answer for many of us. You got to be really careful. What do you do when you are weary? And maybe the Spirit of God today just needs to reveal that to you and go, you know what? I love you. I created you. I'm for you. But this is becoming a pattern in your life that I want to break you of. Don't listen to your excuses. Let your faith rise in me. And when you understand that, Athens Church, here's what happens. When you lock in to the future dinner party with Jesus, then you lean into our bottom line for today, which is simply this. Don't let what you don't know, rob you of what you can do, because this week you can do this through God's help. As weary as you are, as soul tired as you are, if you will walk in step with the Spirit, I believe this week God can rise up the fruit of faithfulness and allow you to pour out your best. So to be really, really clear, what are we asking you to do? I want you to pick one area of your life this week. It could be your health, it could be your finances, it could be your marriage, it could be school, it could be work. You choose according to your time with the Lord, and you pour out your best in one form or fashion this week. And by doing that, I believe it's going to show up at the dinner party of Jesus. But I think faith will rise. And so how do we do that? Well, fortunately, the New Testament's really clear. Fortunately, the Apostle Paul is really clear. Here's what he would say to us. Hey, if you want to pour out your best this week, Athens Church, here's what you got to do. This is what Paul would say. So I say, walk by the Spirit and not gratify the desires of, in our case today, not gratify the desires of weariness. Is it normal to be weary? Yes. Is it supernatural to be faithful in a season of weariness? Yes. Is it going to require the God of the universe to draw beside us and in us and through us? Yes. But that's the good news. He's promised us that he's with us and he's for us and he's walking in and through us forever and ever and leading us home. And that's why I believe sometime in eternity, I don't know how this is going to work because it's going to be a long time, right? All that time, I think you and I might be at the dinner party together and we have a conversation and we say, remember October the 11th, 2020? Remember, by the way, October 10th when Georgia beat Tennessee, but remember October the 11th, 2020? Remember we talked about this moment? Here's what I did that week. That is what is before you. And the Spirit of God, Athens Church, is with you. So let's let faithfulness rise. Let's choose faithfulness in a season of weariness. And let's see how it shows up at the future dinner party with Jesus.